It's late at night. The room is quiet. Your shoulders are shaking. Your breathing is uneven. And before you even notice it, your dog is there. Maybe they nudge your hand. Maybe they press their head against your chest. Maybe they just sit beside you completely still. Most people assume this is coincidence. Maybe the dog heard a strange noise. Maybe they're curious about why you're making unusual sounds. But behavioral neuroscience tells a completely different story. What your dog is doing in that moment, when you're crying, is part of one of the most remarkable emotional communication systems that exists between two species on this planet. And most owners have absolutely no idea it's happening. Let's start with the obvious theory. Dogs react to sound. Crying makes strange noises. Sniffing, shaking breaths, changes in tone. So maybe your dog is just reacting to an unfamiliar sound. It sounds reasonable. Except for one problem. In 2012, researchers at the University of London conducted a study where dogs were exposed to recordings of human emotional sounds: laughter, neutral talking, and crying. And the results were strange. When dogs heard laughter, they stayed relaxed. When they heard normal talking, they mostly ignored it. But when they heard someone crying, their behavior changed dramatically. They approached the sound, slowly, often with lowered posture. It's a classic canine signal of concern. But here's the part that surprised researchers. The dogs didn't approach the crying person the way they approached someone calling them to play. They approached them the way dogs approach distressed pack members: carefully, quietly, almost cautiously. In other words, they weren't responding to the sound. They were responding to the emotion behind it. But that raises a much deeper question. How does a dog, an entirely different species, recognize a human emotion in the first place? To understand that, we need to talk about something called emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is one of the most basic forms of empathy. It's what happens when one individual's emotional state automatically influences another's. Humans experience it constantly. If someone in a room starts laughing uncontrollably, other people often begin laughing too. If someone nearby becomes anxious, that tension spreads through the group. For a long time, scientists believed emotional contagion was mostly limited to humans and a few highly social animals. But dogs changed that assumption. In 2015, researchers in Sweden ran an experiment measuring cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone, in dog owner pairs. They discovered something remarkable. When the human's stress levels increased, the dog's cortisol levels increased too. Even if the dog had no direct reason to be stressed, their bodies were literally mirroring their owner's emotional state. Two nervous systems, synchronizing across species. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because dogs don't just detect human emotion, they actively try to respond to it. In another experiment conducted at Goldsmiths, University of London, volunteers pretended to cry in front of dogs they had never met before. The dogs had two options. They could approach the crying person or their own owner. Almost every dog chose the crying stranger. Think about that for a moment. A complete stranger. But the dog approached them anyway. Why? Because crying triggers something deeply embedded in canine social behavior, a response to distress signals within the group. In wolf packs, when a member becomes injured or distressed, other pack members approach cautiously. They lick the face. They nuzzle. They maintain close proximity, not to solve the problem, but to reinforce social bonding and stability within the group. And domestic dogs inherited those instincts. But something even stranger happened during the domestication process. Over thousands of years living alongside humans, dogs evolved specialized abilities to read human emotional cues. Facial expressions, body posture, changes in breathing, even microscopic shifts in muscle tension. In fact, researchers have found that dogs can distinguish between human facial expressions of happiness and sadness with surprising accuracy. And when a dog sees a sad face, their brain reacts differently. Using fMRI scans, neuroscientists studying canine brain activity discovered that dogs activate regions associated with emotional processing when exposed to human distress signals. In other words, your dog isn't just hearing that you're crying, they're interpreting it. But there is another layer to this interaction that makes it even more extraordinary. Because when your dog comes to sit beside you while you're crying, something begins happening inside both of your brains. A neurochemical called oxytocin starts to rise. Oxytocin is often called the bonding hormone. It's the same chemical that strengthens the bond between parents and children, between close friends, between romantic partners. And when dogs interact with humans during moments of emotional connection, eye contact, touch, physical closeness, both species experience a surge in oxytocin at the same time. Your brain releases it, your dog's brain releases it simultaneously, which means that when your dog presses against you while you're crying, your nervous systems begin regulating each other. Your breathing slows, your heart rate stabilizes, your stress hormone levels begin to fall. Not just because you feel comforted, but because a biological feedback loop is happening between two species that evolved together. And the more you pet your dog during that moment, the stronger that loop becomes. But here's something almost nobody talks about. Your dog might actually detect your distress before you even realize you're upset. Dogs possess an extraordinary sense of smell. Their noses contain up to 300 million scent receptors, compared to about 6 million in humans. That means they can detect microscopic chemical changes in your body. And when humans experience emotional stress, our bodies release subtle shifts in hormones that alter our scent. Dogs can smell those changes. In fact, in controlled experiments, dogs were able to distinguish between sweat samples collected from humans during calm states and sweat samples collected during stress, without seeing the person at all, just by scent, which means that long before you start crying, your dog may already know something is wrong. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that most dog owners never realize. Sometimes, when people cry intensely, dogs don't approach. Instead, they hesitate, or they watch quietly from a distance. And that doesn't mean your dog doesn't care. It usually means something else. Dogs are incredibly sensitive to emotional intensity. If the distress signal is extremely strong, some dogs pause first to assess the situation. In the wild, sudden, intense distress can signal danger. So a dog might observe before approaching. It's not indifference, it's caution. But once the dog recognizes that the source of distress is their trusted human, the response almost always follows. They move closer. They stay nearby. They maintain contact. Because in the canine mind, emotional proximity is one of the most powerful ways to stabilize a social bond. But there's something else worth paying attention to. If your dog suddenly becomes unusually attentive when you're upset, more protective, more alert, more physically close than usual, it may not just be empathy. Dogs are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in human behavior. And sometimes they react to distress by entering a kind of protective mode. In multi-person households, researchers have observed dogs positioning themselves physically between a distressed owner and other people in the room. Not aggressively, but deliberately, almost like a silent barrier. Because in the dog's perception of the world, emotional distress within the pack is something that needs to be stabilized, and sometimes protected. So the next time you're crying and your dog quietly walks over, rests their head on your leg, and refuses to leave your side, remember what's actually happening. Your dog isn't confused. Your dog isn't curious. Your dog is responding to one of the oldest signals of distress that social animals understand. And 15,000 years of shared evolution have taught them exactly what to do. Move closer, stay nearby, and wait until the storm passes. Because in your dog's world, when a member of the pack is hurting, you don't walk away. You stay right beside them. And strangely enough, the science suggests that in those moments, your dog might understand your emotions more clearly than most humans do. If this changed how you see your dog, subscribe to the channel and tell me something in the comments. The last time you were upset, did your dog come closer? Or did they quietly watch from across the room? Because in the next video, we're going to explore something even stranger. Why dogs stare directly into your eyes, and what scientists discovered happening inside their brains when they do.